Ladies and gentlemen, the courtroom went silent, all eyes upon Kody Brown as he entered through those heavy wooden doors. The footsteps sounded heavy and deliberate, each step commanding the attention of everyone in the room. He was not only any man on trial, he was the patriarch of one of America's most scandalous families. A man whose personal life had been aired on national TV for more than 10 years. They had all watched the dysfunctional dynamic of his marriages, the crying, and the ongoing battle for control. But today, the cameras vanished, smiles were non-existent, and reality was poised to be subjected to the brightest light conceivable, the harsh scrutiny of a courtroom. Kody's gaze rushed around the room, fixing on familiar faces that had once symbolized love, harmony, and family. Christine, Janelle, and Meri were seated together, their heads held stiffly, their faces stern. They weren't there to smile for the TLC audience, or to fulfill their roles as loyal wives. No, today they were witnesses. Women whose testimony could be used to destroy him and ruin his reputation, or to free him from his guilty conscience. Without even speaking, their silence was louder than any witness. They sat like a row of matronly accusation, their faces beaded with rage. A coalesced horde turned against the man they once called husband. The audience at the back shifted awkwardly in seats. Journalists wrote madly in their notebooks, aware that what happened here would not only be scandal of the day, but a moment of reality TV history spilling over into real-life scandal. There were some fans of Sister Wives who had come miles to sit in the public gallery, eager for the truth behind the sanitized shows they had watched for years. This was no longer entertainment. This was live, unadulterated reality. Kody fidgeted with his collar, his actions stiff and robot-like. His normally confident smile was not there, replaced by a tense look that spoke of both pride and fear. For years he had portrayed himself as the head of his family, the one who bore the burden of 4 marriages and dozens of children on his shoulders. But now, as he stood there, his authority seemed to diminish under the weight of the law. The bailiff's voice boomed, crisp and authoritative. All rise. The room rose and the judge emerged, her black robe flowing as she made her way to her seat. The ring of the gavel on wood resonated through the courtroom. This court is now in session, she stated, leaving no leeway for drama or excuses. This was not a TV set. This was not a confession interview. This was the world outside of make-believe, and there were real consequences to suffer. Kody sat down, the leather chair groaning beneath him. His thoughts had to be running rampant, yet his face couldn't seem to maintain calm. He was always one who worked well under the spotlight, who commanded attention with authority in front of the lenses. But now the spotlight was crueler. The lights weren't soft and flattering. They were blinding. And rather than having producers feed him questions he could turn, there would be attorneys, merciless and ready to lay bare every contradiction. The room was heavy with silence, punctuated only by the scratching of pens and the muffled hum of the air conditioning. Every individual present in the courtroom was well aware that what was going on was larger than a legal fight. It was a reckoning. For years the Brown family's tale had been depicted in black and white terms of loyalty, religion, and the troubles of polygamy. But there had always been cracks beneath the surface. Fights, jealousy, money squabbles, and betrayals nicely packaged in edited accounts. Now those cracks were about to widen far beyond anything people had ever imagined. Christine sat with her hands wrapped tightly around each other, her knuckles white, her mouth pressed into a thin line. She had been the first to publicly break away, the first to publicly announce that her life with Kody was no longer tenable. People had witnessed her crying on television, her frustration, her bravery. But here in this courthouse, her part was no longer emotional confessional. Here her words mattered. They would be used against her. Janelle's eyes never wavered from Kody. Decades of marriage, financial arrangements, and vows lingered between them like specters. She regarded him not with a wife's warmth, but with the detached resoluteness of one prepared to face long-embraced lies. Meri, ever the quiet one in the spotlight, sat in a sort of calm dignity that seemed impenetrable. Though her marriage to Kody had ended years before the others did, there was something compelling about her. Her presence made everyone remember that the hurt within this family went back decades. Reporters creased forward, seizing every hint of emotion. For them, it wasn't merely a trial. It was history in the process of being made. A previously much-loved reality TV star, now compelled to meet accountability not on a couch with cameras filming, but before a judge who could take away more than mere pride. Kody swallowed hard, the sound jarring and unwelcome in the otherwise quiet room. He attempted to catch the eyes of his previous wives, but they never blinked. If sympathy was what he was seeking, he would not find it here. The judge's voice pierced the quiet. "Mr. Brown, you will get your turn to speak. But let me be clear on one thing. This courtroom is not a theater. This is not a play. This is a forum for truth and nothing more." Her words fell like stones, each syllable stripping away the fantasy that had been around him for so long. The crowd was in suspense. This was the moment for which they had all been waiting. The drop of the curtain, the shattering of the facade. Kody shifted awkwardly, his fingers tangling with the corner of a piece of paper he held tightly in his fists. And then, briefly, there was a glimmer of vulnerability in his eyes. The man who had once towered over the cameras on national television, the man who had asserted his decisions and insisted on respect from those about him, now looked diminutive, exposed. The burden of the courtroom, the glare of his former wives, the unflinching gaze of the judge, all of it bore down upon him like an unseen weight. Each of them was aware that they were watching the beginning of something historic. Not only a trial, but the stripping away of layers, the unveiling of the man behind the lenses. The quiet was not just quiet anymore. It was anticipation. It was tension. It was the stillness before the storm. And then, with one final thwack of the gavel, the game was afoot. The trial of Kody Brown was underway, and nothing, not his former charm, not his TV stardom, not even his own words, could halt the storm that was about to break over him. The air was charged with tension, more than anyone had ever experienced. It was not silence per se, it was the kind of silence that hums, that vibrates, that makes your chest harder with each ticking second. Within that courtroom, the air was heavy, as if each breath was borrowed, and each sound amplified. Even the slightest motion, the rustle of papers, the squeak of a chair, the nervous cough of a spectator, resounded louder than it needed to. Kody Brown sat at the defense table, his jaw clenched, his eyes scanning back and forth, as if looking for a friendly face in a sea of faces who were all here only to watch him lose. This was not the living room of his Las Vegas house, not the manufactured set of a TLC show. There were no producers to come in and fill the gap, no editors to hone his words to make him sympathetic. Here, each look, each stumble, each pause counted. Here, each second was evidence. Seated across from him were the women who had once constructed a life around him, who had invested their time, their youth, and their loyalty. They did not dress for television. They did not dress to play a role. Christine sat nearest to the witness stand, her body turned slightly away from him, as if even close proximity was more than she could tolerate. Her face was grim, her eyes fixed ahead. She was the one who had stood up first in public, the one who had made years of silent anger into a courageous cry of independence. And here, in this courtroom, she was dressed like a soldier preparing for war. Janelle sat next to her, herself calm but the tempest raging within, always practical, measured, the one who attempted to stave off the chaos of such a big family. But today there was no staving off, no mending rough edges. Her gaze did not shift from Kody, unwavering and unblinking, as though challenging him to lie about the things that she knew to be. Her presence was subdued, yet it was powerful, a different sort of power that Kody was accustomed to encountering. Meri, even though she and Kody were apart in more than one way for years, had decided to be there as well. To some, her appearance was unexpected. She might have stayed away, kept her distance, let the others battle their fight. She didn't. Her motivation might have been different, her narrative distinct, but she too had been molded by the same man, by the same promises, by the same betrayals. And in that courtroom, she wasn't merely a witness. She was part of the accounting. With each time Kody's eyes darted in their direction, the tension in the room changed. He attempted to appear collected, attempted to conceal the increasing tension that crept into his shoulders, the way he drummed his fingers on the table. But the tension wasn't limited to him. and his former wives. The whole room buzzed with unasked questions. What would be announced today? How much of the glossy TV rendition of their existence had been a fabrication? The gallery reporters hunched forward, their pens scritching wildly, committing to paper the details. Fans waiting outside the courtroom would consume like wildfire. They were not reporting on money or deals, on betrayal and a family dynasty erected on shaky ground now trembling under the burden of the truth. Some murmured between themselves in hushed voices, already crafting headlines. Others sat impassive, their eyes keen, waiting for the very first break in Kody's carefully constructed defenses. The judge pushed up her glasses, sweeping the room with a piercing look that stilled even the softest murmur. Her control was unassailable, her demeanor commanding. She was aware that the public's eyes were upon this case, but she held herself with the sort of discipline that would not be diverted by show. But even she could not help but acknowledge the energy of tension that filled the room, the excitement for what was to be unveiled. As the clerk rifled through the first pile of papers, the sound of paper rustling was thunderous. Each page that was turned served as a reminder that the truth sat before them in black and white, ready to be revealed. Bank statements, contracts, promises written but unfulfilled, years of household finances, hitherto behind the closed doors of their expensive-looking mansions, were soon to be made into public evidence. Kody shifted once more in his seat, his hand fleetingly across his lips, as if he were attempting to suppress words, perhaps attempting to suppress fear. His gaze darted toward his lawyer, pleading for reassurance, but the lawyer's face was impassive. The spotlight, the burden, the weight of this trial, it wasn't divided, it was all his own. A visitor from the gallery let out a sneeze, shattering the silence for a mere second. Even that was awkward, however, as if an intruder within the heavy air of anticipation. The tension immediately snapped back with increased force and weight, as if the room itself were holding breath, poised to hear the blast of reality. Christine slowly turned her head, barely at all, to glance at Kody. It wasn't a glance of love, not even rage. It was something much colder. It was the gaze of a person who had borne wounds for years, one who had been cast off, silenced, minimized, and was now stepping into the moment where silence would no longer work for him. That one glance was full of years of stories, unspoken but undeniable. Janelle came behind, her eyes softer but firmer. To her, this was not merely about betrayal. It was about justice, about responsibility. She had been pragmatic, had suffered, had survived, but she had also witnessed too much to keep it up any longer. And when her eyes met his, the message was unmistakable. You cannot escape this. Meri did not move, her face impassive. It could be mistaken for detachment by some, but people who knew her tale grasped the richness behind her composed face. She didn't have to say anything or glare. Her presence spoke volumes. She had been present at the start. She had survived the ascendancy. And now she stood here at the inevitable collapse. The quiet stretched, warping, compressing, until it seemed that the walls of the courthouse itself were resisting the truth. And in the stillness, everyone knew, the act was finished. The spit-polished family photo, the smiling patriarch, the neatly groomed narrative, that's over. The judge raised her gavel once more, but didn't bring it down. Instead, she suspended it, as if measuring its value. This will not be a simple task. She spoke at length, her voice echoing with finality. It will not be brief, and it will not be effortless, but it will be fair. The judge raised, and in this court, fairness is not something we do. We do the law. Remember that as we go on. With that, she rang the gavel again, the crack echoing through the silence like thunder. The trial was not yet officially underway, but the threat had been made, and its ominous presence hung in the air like a storm cloud ready to unleash. Kody exhaled, a sound barely audible but heavy with tension. For the first time perhaps, he realized that the walls around him were not built to protect him, but to confine him. The stage he once controlled had been replaced by a space where every move could unravel him. And as the eyes of the courtroom shifted his way, and the first witness stood poised on the stand, the echo of the judge's words lingered. This was not a stage. This was not a play. This was reality. And reality would be cruel. The courtroom doors had long since shut behind everyone, But the tension had only become denser. Every creak of a chair, every inhale felt magnified. And then, with a subtle cue from the judge, it started. The first witness was summoned. Christine Brown. The room watched her move with their eyes, as she stood up, smoothed down her skirt with firm hands, and made her way to the witness stand. Her movements weren't hasty, and neither were they hesitant. They were deliberate, the sort of steps taken by a woman who had borne years of silence, years of accommodation, and was at last ready to let it all go. She sat down, took the oath, and for an instant sat there, getting herself together. Kody shifted uncomfortably in his seat. His gaze flicked toward her, but Christine didn't glance around. She stood facing the courtroom, her profile serene, but her shoulders nodded, and then she started talking. Her tone was steady, though it had a quiver, perhaps with nervousness, perhaps with the burden of all she'd kept inside. For years, she stated, her eyes flashing just for an instant toward the judge. I gave it all to this family. My time, my trust, my devotion. I believed in what we were creating. But I also believed in promises. Promises that were broken. The words lingered in the air like smoke. The audience leaned forward, caught up by the unvarnished truth of what she said. She didn't shout, didn't act, she didn't have to. Each word bit harder, because it was spoken with still conviction. She continued, explaining how she had given not just emotionally, but also financially, sacrificing having children, and putting her faith in a man who had in her mind not protected that faith. She talked about late nights worrying about bills, of bewilderment regarding missing money, of a nagging feeling that there were secrets being kept from her. Each of these memories seemed to fall in the room like a rock, heavy and irrefutable. Kody gritted his jaw, his attorney writing wildly, but Christine never wavered. When she concluded her testimony, her gaze finally shifted to him. For the first time that day, their eyes met, and in that look was no fear, only clarity. She had spoken her truth, and nothing of his charm could now quiet it. Then Janelle appeared. Cool, steady Janelle, always seeming to be the stabilizing influence in the midst of their chaotic household. She approached the stand with calm strength, her head held high, her attitude measured. If Christine's words bore fire, Janelle's would bear ice, controlled, keen, and precise. She started off by conceding the difficulty of their lives together. The struggle of bringing up a large family, the sacrifices that everyone had made. Then her tone changed, hardened. What was asked of us, she said measuredly, was trust. We trusted him with choices. We trusted him with assets. We trusted him with destinies. But repeatedly that trust was betrayed. She talked of investments that had failed, of funds that had vanished into business ideas that didn't make sense, of promises made not once, not twice, but repeatedly, promises that never materialized. She recounted instances where she had raised her voice in questioning, only to be dismissed with unconvincing answers. Instances where she had attempted to voice concerns, only to be informed that she didn't comprehend. Her voice never broke, never wavered. She didn't require passion to make her argument. Her measured tone made it even more compelling. The facts she presented depicted a tale of mismanagement, of subterfuge, of loyalty manipulated. Kody sat with his hands clenched together on the table, looking down at it as she spoke. He appeared smaller, somehow as if the weight of her words was crushing him, holding him back in the chair. And then Meri appeared. The courtroom changed as she stood up. There had been speculation that she might not even say a word. For years she'd said nothing. Remote, her marriage with Kody on the rocks, well before the others had reached their breaking point. But there she was, standing from her chair, walking toward the stand, her expression stern, her steps elegant but determined. Her words were quiet, barely above a whisper, yet there was something beneath them that everyone heard. I was the first, she said, the first wife, the first to have faith in the dream of what this family was to be. And I held on to that faith, even when it was painful, even when it cost me more than anyone realized. The courtroom was quiet. You might catch the quiet hum of the fluorescent lights overhead, the rustle of a reporter adjusting his pen, the judge's own breath as she leaned forward to hear more intently. Meri continued, her voice the weight of years. She told of betrayal, not in figures, not in tally, but in the wear of love, respect, and trust. She told of being pushed aside, of seeing her position diminish until she was barely a presence in her own marriage. She did not use anger. She used sadness. But that sadness had more power than fury ever could. Years, she told me, her eyes shining, but her voice steady. I kept telling myself it would be better, that if I just waited, if I just prayed harder, it would get better. But it didn't. And what's worst is not even what was lost. It's the knowledge that the truth was always there, and I was too blind to see it because I believed him. Her words lingered in the air, long after she stopped speaking. No one moved, no one whispered. The silence was absolute. It was as if the entire room was holding its breath, stunned by the raw honesty of her testimony. Christine's testimony had been fire. Janelle's had been ice. But Meri's was the echo of a wound that had never healed, and it struck deeper than anyone expected. When she left the stand, she didn't glance at Kody. She didn't have to. Her very presence had been a message. The three testimonies taken together were a portrait too vivid, too incriminating to discount. It wasn't about money, or vows, or TV shows. It was about shattered trust, shattered loyalty, and years of sacrifice going unvalued. Kody sat stiff in his chair, his complexion pale, his eyes locked onto the table in front of him. For the first time, he was bereft of defenses. The individual who had once held the spotlight of a household, of cameras, of a whole nation of audiences, was now just a man confronted with the words of those who knew him best. And those words had spoken with a force he could not refute. And as the judge gazed down at him, her face impassive, the silence filling the courtroom wasn't tension any longer. It was the force of truth, weighing heavy, insisting to be spoken. When the final ex-wife left the stand, the courtroom was more silent than any gavel drop. Their words hung in the air, like phantoms that could not be dispelled, and each of their testimonies became the entwined thread of the last, until they became an irrefutable wall of fact. The observers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, anticipating, knowing what was to come. The judge's gaze landed on Kody Brown. It was his turn. Kody stood up slowly, adjusting his jacket, his jaw clenched tight, his shoulders drawn back in a bid to call forth the confidence he used to wear so effortlessly. For years he had fed on attention, on dominating a room, on persuading those around him with charm and conviction. But this wasn't the cast of Sister Wives. This was not his sitting room, where his voice was the strongest and usually the last heard. This was a courtroom, and here, every syllable counted. He approached the stand, and for one moment, he was quite the man fans remembered. The father, the leader, the one who had held an unconventional family together under unprecedented conditions. His voice, when he finally spoke, had that same cadence, measured and firm. "I want to make something very clear," he started, his gaze scanning the courtroom, touching lightly on Christine, then Janelle, then Meri. "I have always tried to do what I believed was in the best interest of my family. Every choice I've made, every action, was with the motivation of taking care of them, keeping them safe, and leading them." There was determination in his voice, but there was also tension, an edge of defensiveness that everyone could detect. "I know what's been said about me," he went on, his eyes darting toward the judge. "I know the accusations, the allegations that I mismanaged, that I lied, that I betrayed trust. But I am not a thief. I am not a manipulator. I am a man who attempted, sometimes botched, yes, but attempted to keep together something that most cannot even conceive of managing. 4 marriages, over a dozen children, countless obligations. You think that's easy? Do you think that does not entail blunders?" The words echoed through the wooden panels of the courtroom. His lawyer nodded wordlessly, urging, but the faces of his former wives were impassive, unmoved. Kody continued, leaning forward a bit, hands clasped on either side of the stand. "I worked. I sacrificed. I built houses. I handled money. I gave everything I had. Did I always get it right? No. Did I make decisions that other people didn't like? Yes, but that doesn't convict me of all these things that are being alleged here today. That makes me human." He allowed the word to hang, narrowing his eyes slightly, as if challenging anyone to disagree. For a moment, it appeared that he was taking charge again, that the Kody who used to command the opinion of TV viewers was back, ready to weave his tale into something credible. But then came the questions. The lawyer for the ex-wives rose, papers in front of him, voice steady but cutting. Mr. Brown, you say you did everything for your family. Let's discuss the finances. Can you tell me about the series of withdrawals in March, April, and June of last year? Withdrawals that amount to more than $200,000. The question landed like a stone tossed into still water, sending ripples through the room. The spectators leaned forward, reporters' pens scratching furiously against notepads. Kody hesitated. It was only a second, but it was enough. His lips parted, his eyes darted down toward the table, then back up. Those funds, he said, his voice slower now, were used for family purposes, housing, security, things that were necessary. The lawyer pushed, and yet, no invoices equal those figures. No accounts reflect those monies spent on housing or security. Do you have evidence? Silence. Kody's jaw clenched again. Not all of it was written down. Not all of it can be shown with invoices. Sometimes in a household this large, you simply do what you need to do in the moment. The judge raised one eyebrow slightly, her face expressionless but keen. The attorney did not back down. So you're asking this court to believe that nearly $250,000 vanished into instinct? A murmur spread through the gallery. Kody's cheeks flushed, his calm fraying at the edges. His voice lifted slightly, defensive. I'm asking this court to see that my life, my family isn't common. You can't stick it into neat little accounting boxes, like a business deal. It's messy. It's complicated. And yeah, sometimes money was shuffled around, but always for the benefit of the family. Kody gulped hard, his voice now little more than a whisper. I did what I thought was best, he mumbled. The conviction was lost. The man who had once dominated the living rooms with his loud voice, who had led his family with confidence, who had made millions of watchers believe that his method, though unusual, was correct, was now a figure clinging to excuses, his defenses weakening with each inquiry. And as he left the stand, the room let out its collective breath, tension changing. For the first time, the power dynamic had unmistakably shifted. The ex-wives had testified in unison. The evidence lay in wait. And Kody's defense, however eloquent, no longer held the significance it did. He sat back down, his skin white, his shoulders sagging. The trial was hardly halfway done. But everyone in that courtroom was aware, the defense he had prayed would save him had but unveiled the weaknesses that would destroy him. The courtroom had already seen hours of testimony, words weighed down with feeling, accusations flung like jagged stones, and defenses uttered with fire and urgency. But nothing could hold a candle to what was to follow next. So far, it had all been words, opinions, anecdotes, reinterpretations. Now came the turn of the icy, unforgiving force of facts. The ex-wife's lawyer rose slowly, clutching a pile of thick folders, one folder after another, each neat, crisp, filled to the brim with documents, papers that appeared to bear the burden of unspoken truths. The rustle of pages itself was enough to coax the spectators forward in their seats, to halt reporters' pens mid-stroke. Something was going down. Your Honor, the lawyer started, voice calm and measured. We've heard the stories, we've heard the narratives. But today we bring the records, the papers that will reveal the truth about Mr. Brown's financial transactions. The judge nodded. A serene face but piercing eyes. Alert. The bailiff stepped forward to help, passing copies, nudging binders across the bench. Each gesture seemed like the countdown of a clock ticking towards explosion. Christine's eyes were fixed on the folders, her hands locked together in her lap. Janelle leaned forward, lips compressed into a thin line, the fire in her eyes unwavering. Meri sat quietly, though the slightest movement of her shoulders betrayed her anxiety. And Kody? Kody was immobilized, his jaw clenched, his fingers drumming against the smooth wood of the table, as if the beat could silence the pulse of his beating heart. The first document was projected on the overhead. A bank statement. Rows and rows of figures, deposits, withdrawals, balances that fell and rose like a tempestuous sea. The attorney underscored a few lines in red. "These are withdrawals," he said, voice booming for the gallery, but clear and forceful. "Withdrawals amounting to more than $200,000 over the course of only 3 months. Withdrawals," Mr. Brown asserted, "were for family needs." But where did the money go? He turned the page. Receipts, or more accurately, receipts lacking. "We looked, we scoured every account. There are no receipts, no invoices, no evidence to demonstrate that these monies were spent on the family. What we did find is something altogether different." Silence fell so profound it appeared the walls themselves breathed a slow breath. The following page was visible. Property records. Titles, deeds, signatures in black ink. The attorney touched the screen with his finger. Mr. Brown bought land around the same time. Not for the family. Not in the name of the household. But in his name. Alone, in secret. Gasps spread through the courtroom. Even the onlookers who had heard rumors for decades could not cover their shock. The noise was sudden, like a crack of a whip, followed by an even quieter silence as everyone digested what had just occurred. Kody shifted in his seat uncomfortably, his face hardening, a flush rising up his neck. His lawyer leaned into him, speaking in an urgent whisper, but Kody didn't answer. His eyes were trained on the papers as if looking hard enough could make them disappear. The wife's lawyer didn't let up. Another page turned. Another surprise. Credit card bills this time, detailing expensive expenditures, flights, restaurant dinners, transactions far removed from the low-budget lifestyle of a family in economic distress. "These aren't the moves of a man who is sacrificing for his family," the lawyer declared definitively. "These are the moves of a man who looked out for himself as his household struggled." As bills remained unpaid, as promises were broken, Mr. Brown lavished. And never did he reveal these to their expenditures. Each word hit like a sledgehammer. Christine's eyes welled with unshed tears, no longer tears of sadness but of vindication. Janelle nodded curtly, her face stern, unyielding. Meri, as always silent, closed her eyes for an instant, as if allowing the truth to seep into her bones. The judge moved closer, poring over the papers in her hand, her expression growing increasingly severe with each page turn. Her mask remained impassive, but the silence was more oppressing than any tantrum might have been. Kody finally broke his silence, his voice gruff, piercing the quiet. "This is out of context," he spoke hastily, his words spilling over one another. "Those expenditures, those houses, those were investments. Investments in the future of the family. They weren't selfish choices, they were maneuvers." But the lawyer was prepared, his counterattack swift. "Then why, Mr. Brown, were none of these investments made known to Mr. and Mrs. Brown? Why were their names missing from the documents? Why did the family reap no benefit, no return, from these so-called strategies?" The question came down hard, unshakable. Kody's mouth opened, but no words escaped. His fists curled on the table, his white knuckles a stark contrast to the dark wood. The assurance that had sustained him during his defense was absent, replaced by anger, by the unshakable demeanor of a man backed into a corner by his own secrets. The lawyer pushed on, producing additional records, tax returns, indicating inconsistencies, figures that failed to match, reported income lower than the lifestyle revealed. It was a mosaic of evidence, every piece falling into the next, creating a picture that words alone never could. The gallery was abuzz with gossiping whispers, heads shaking, eyes wide in incredulity. Journalists were writing furiously, already composing headlines in their minds. Kody Brown exposed in court, the evidence no one saw coming. And then there was the last page, the one that apparently shattered the last remaining vestige of composure Kody possessed. It was a contract, signed not by the family, but by Kody himself, committing to an investment that redirected funds entirely outside of the family trust. "This," the lawyer stated, holding the paper aloft for everyone to view, "is the truth. The truth concealed behind excuses, behind TV cameras, behind the facade of control." Mr. Brown did not act in the interests of his family. He acted in his own interests. Silence after those words was choking. Kody's face was white now, his lips clamped tightly together, his body slouched forward, as if sheer will could keep him intact. His ex-wives did not gloat, they did not smile or triumph. They just sat, the years of doubt and suspicion finally ratified before their eyes. For the audience, for the fans who had been watching the Browns saga for decades, it was like seeing the final curtain fall on a play that had gone on much too long. The man once at the top of a vast family empire, now found himself reduced to a man drowning in paper, figures and evidence he could no longer ignore. The judge at last addressed them, her tone serene but icy. The court has considered the papers. The evidence raised severe issues of credibility and accountability. Mr. Brown, you will get a chance to rebut, but I would suggest you take your answers with gravity. This evidence cannot be brushed aside. Kody's lips curled but uttered no word. His shoulders fell a little, his eyes expressionless with the knowledge that no words, no fire, could burn away what was now exposed. The gallery sighed together, the reality heavy in the air. This was no longer stories and interpretation. This was fact. And those facts had just turned the whole trial onto a new ruinous course. The atmosphere within the courtroom had shifted. It was palpable, as if the oxygen itself had been sucked out, leaving a heavy pressure upon all who stood there. The evidence had struck with a thunderclap. Papers piled high with truths too piercing to be denied. For years suspicion had murmured in the background. But now such suspicion had turned into irrefutable fact, set down in black and white. Kody sat rigid in his chair, his jaw muscles straining furiously as he struggled to maintain his composure, but his expression gave him away. His eyes flicked between the judge and the mountain of papers, to his ex-wives seated across from him, their solid front greater now than ever before when they shared his house. Christine stretched forward, eyes on him, not gloating, not smirking, but burning with a sort of icy fire. This was not for revenge. This was for finally being listened to. Janelle's eyes burned sharp and steady, the face of a woman who'd spent years doing math in her mind, and now had evidence of what her gut had screamed for so long. And Meri? She sat still, her palms folded in her lap, her eyes for a second, before she gazed up at him with something keener than anger, disappointment. The judge's voice broke the silence, heavy but even. Mr. Brown, this court has considered what has been shown. What I require of you is straightforward. Can you offer any verifiable explanation of these discrepancies? For the properties, the money, the contracts? Everyone's focus turned to him. The room seemed to contract around his seat. He leaned forward, interlacing his fingers as if in prayer, his voice raw when he did finally speak. I never intended to harm anyone, he told them, and the gallery bent forward. Yes, funds were transferred. Yes, there were decisions made without complete openness. But you have to realize, I was under tremendous pressure. This life, this family, it wasn't typical. Nothing was. I was juggling responsibilities, expectations, loans, opportunities each day. I made choices I believed were right at the time, and perhaps they weren't flawless. Perhaps I erred. But I wasn't robbing my family. I was trying to preserve it. The language was fervent, but the fervor no longer held power. It held desperation. The voice cracked a little at the edges, and for the first time, the courtroom witnessed not the confident patriarch of television, but a man who was struggling with the collapse of the world that he had constructed around himself. The wives' attorney didn't wait. Mr. Brown, no one disputes your family's circumstances were complicated. What is in dispute is integrity. You talk about saving the family, and your actions, recorded actions, demonstrate that you made decisions in secret, decisions that served your interest, not theirs. You did more than make errors. You covered them. The words cut crisply through the air. Kody's shoulders dropped for an instant, then stiffened as he attempted once again to project that air of control. But the dynamic in the room was forever altered. The power balance had shifted. He was no longer in charge of guiding the narrative. The facts had seen to it. Writers wrote more quickly. Murmurs swept across the audience. To the onlookers it was as if they were witnessing a king inchingly deprived of his crown, not violently, but through truth. Christine's eyes sparkled, not with tears, but with the deep sigh of vindication. For years she had been characterized as emotional, as leaving behind a life others judged as enviable. But now, in this instant, her decision to leave was vindicated for all to witness. Janelle's lips bent into the slightest smile, not joy, but relief. Numbers had always revealed a tale that no one wished to hear, and now the courtroom had ratified it. Meri moved imperceptibly, her eyes warm but unyielding, as if to say quietly, "I gave you every opportunity, and this is what you chose." The judge leaned back, her face stern, unmoved by emotion. "Mr. Brown, the balance of evidence cannot be dismissed. Though I appreciate your assertion of intent, here the question is one of transparency. This court is not considering your way of life. It is considering your actions, and your actions present grave questions." That line resonated, not only in the walls of the courtroom, but in the hearts of all who stood there. It was the breaking point. The point where the illusion of control Kody had worked so hard to preserve for 40 years disintegrated before the very eyes of those who once had faith in him. Kody changed again, his hands fidgeting, his breathing labored. He came close to opening his mouth to say something, but words did not emerge. His throat constricted, words trapped in a knot of half-truths and rationalizations. The ensuing silence was louder than any presentation he might have made. The wives' attorney, smelling victory, addressed the judge. "Your Honor, what this trial demonstrates is not mere fiscal mismanagement. It reveals a pattern of deceit, a pattern in which Mr. Kody remained seated for a moment, hunched in his chair, gazing down at the gleaming wood of the table in front of him. The pressure of it all bore down on his shoulders. He was a man who had stood before millions, once brash, invincible. Now today, in this courtroom, he was small. The tide had shifted, and it was not working in his direction. The judge had witnessed it. The ex-wives had sensed it. The audience had seen it, and Kody Brown himself knew it. Whatever lay ahead, the tide had turned against him. The courtroom had been abuzz with the recess. But when the bailiff brought everybody back to order, silence fell once more. The wooden doors thudded shut behind them, deadening the sounds of the hallway, where reporters shouted for morsels of information. Inside, the air was charged, electrified with the fact that the end was at hand. This was the moment of all moments. The judge's decision, the verdict that would vindicate Kody Brown, or strip him of the final veneers of his carefully constructed persona. Kody sat at the defense table. His shoulders knotted, his fists curled so tightly, his knuckles went white. His lawyer mouthed words into his ear, in urgent whispers, but he gazed at the bench. Whatever he was being told did not matter. Kody was looking down the face of fate itself, and he knew it. Across from him, Christine, Janelle, and Meri sat side by side. They hadn't rehearsed their unity, hadn't staged it for cameras. It was something natural, born of shared struggle, shared betrayal, and now shared vindication. Each of them carried a different emotion. Christine's quiet determination, Janelle's steady calculation, Meri's weary but resolute calm. Together they looked stronger than they ever had while living under his roof. The judge entered, and all the people in the room stood as the gavel fell. She put on her chair, her robe flowing like a darkness that held with it both authority and finality. When she spoke, her voice was firm, demanding attention without having to increase its volume. "This court has read the testimonies, the pleadings, and most significantly, the evidence put on record." She scanned the room with her eyes. "What has been laid bare here is not merely a family feud. It is one of accountability, trust, and misappropriation of funds intended to benefit several households." Kody's jaw clenched, his lips set in a thin line. He wished to protest, to say something, to beg, but the gravity of the judge's tone held him back. The judge went on, "The proof is of financial withdrawals and investments which were undisclosed, not written down for the family's good, and not explained to anyone in a satisfactory manner. While intent by the defendant to preserve his family's future is asserted, intent without openness is nothing, when those most impacted are not told." Christine blinked, one tear that leaked down her cheek, but her chin still held high. Janelle nodded gently, as though she had been holding out for years on exactly these words. Meri let out a slow breath, her fingers releasing from where they had been clenched tightly together in her lap. The judge leaned forward slightly, her eyes resting on Kody with the full force of authority. Mr. Brown, this court cannot help but see the pattern of conduct outlined in these documents. The inconsistencies are apparent. The steps which were taken were not in accord with a man acting just in the best interest of his family. They were in accord with mismanagement, with hiding things, and with breach of trust. The gallery broke into a ripple of whispers. The bailiff hastened to raise his hand for quiet, but the room's tension was impossible to quiet. The verdict was coming down, and all were well aware. Kody eventually stirred, shaking his head, his voice bursting through the silence. No, no, you don't understand. I did this for them. I sacrificed. Mr. Brown, the judge cut in firmly, her tone slicing through his objection like steel. You will get your turn to answer, but know this. The court's ruling is final. Her words strike like a hammer. This court holds in favor of the plaintiffs. Mr. Brown will be held responsible for the financial discrepancies. Restitution will be ordered to cover the losses incurred by his former wives. Additionally, there will be oversight placed on any future financial transactions, directly involving family assets, to have transparency for the future. The courtroom was filled with a deafening sound, gasps, whispers, the scratch of pens furiously writing down every word. Christine closed her eyes and pressed her hand to her chest for a fleeting moment, relief washing over her face. Janelle stood up, her lips pursed, but her eyes shining with triumph. Meri merely dropped her head for an instant, her face unreadable, but the tiny quiver to her jaw gave away the letting go of years of strain. Kody sat transfixed. His eyes went wide, his face pale, looking at nothing. The gavel fell once more, final and echoing, and he hardly heard it. Outside himself, the world functioned, the judge rising to go, lawyers exchanging handshakes, ex-wives collecting their things. But Kody was frozen in that chair, as if the man who had just seen the walls of his kingdom fall down around him. Christine, Janelle and Meri stood as one, not gloating, not celebrating, but merely breathing, as if finally, after all those years, the air felt lighter, freer. They passed by him without a look, their oneness a message more powerful than any words. To them, the verdict was not about money, it was about truth. About being heard and believed at last, after all these years of silence and shadows. In the hallway outside, the pandemonium was instant. Journalists mobbed, microphones thrust forward, cameras popping all around. Questions shot through the air like arrows. Christine, what do you think about the verdict? Janelle, was this justice, or was it revenge? Meri, what does the future hold for the family? They didn't answer, they didn't need to. Their silence, their calm composure, spoke louder than anything they could have said. The verdict itself was the only statement that mattered. Back inside, Kody finally stirred, his hand running across his face, as though trying to wipe away the reality that clung to him. His attorney placed a hand on his shoulder, murmuring something about appeals, about next steps. But Kody did not react. He sat empty, gazing down at the table, his brain perhaps still holding on to the vision of himself as the leader, the breadwinner, the man in charge. That vision was stripped from him now, destroyed by the blow of the gavel. For the years of fans who had watched this family, the verdict brought an era to a close. The patriarch, who had once been above reproach, had been measured, weighed, and found guilty. And for his former wives, it brought the start of something new, not freedom alone, but vindication. The courtroom slowly emptied, footsteps ringing out on shiny floors, and in their wake, only silence and the musky scent of paper and ink were left. The verdict had been read, the judgment handed down, and in the silence, one truth resounded above all others. Regardless of how intricately a facade is constructed, when the cracks at last appear, the burden of truth will always prevail. The courthouse entrance was a war zone of jumping lights, microphones and panicky voices. As soon as the heavy double doors opened, the mob outside went wild. Reporters surged forward, cameras focused in, and onlookers yelled to get even a glimpse of the individuals at the eye of the hurricane. Christine emerged first, her chin held high, her face serene but unyielding. She did not wear a self-satisfied smile, no hint of victory etched on her face. Instead, her expression emanated something more profound: dignity, relief, and unobtrusive strength. Janelle brought up the rear, her stance firm, each step planned, as if she were anchoring herself to the fresh reality they had just achieved. Meri trailed behind, her eyes shining but unflinching. For years she had been pegged as the side-aligned, the forgotten wife, but now she moved with the dignity of a woman who had survived and endured. The reporters mobbed her, their questions crashing in a whirlwind of sound. "Christine, how does it feel knowing the judge made the decision in your favor? Janelle, do you believe justice was done today? Meri, what is next for you and the family?" Christine turned a fleeting glance to the sea of faces, then looked at Janelle and Meri. They did not respond. They didn't have to. Their silence was louder than any bumper sticker. Together, they walked shoulder to shoulder down those stone stairs, while cameras pursued them relentlessly. It was no longer about the verdict. It was about taking back their lives, their voices, and their narrative. Within, Kody had stayed put, his lawyer beside him. He knew the crowd outside was not ready to congratulate him. The flash of all those cameras was no longer kind. It was critical, merciless. The man who had lived for attention, who had ruled the narrative of his family's saga, now found himself suffocating in it. For the first time, he had no lines to speak, no contrived family interview to temper the punishment. When Kody finally appeared, the response was immediate. The crowd surged forward, voices crying his name, some accusing, some begging for comment, some merely starving for his demise. His face was ashen, his jaw set, but his eyes gave away the tempest within. He attempted to fight his way through the crowd with his attorney protecting him, but there was no pride in his withdrawal. The patriarch, once the hub of a televised empire, now seemed diminished, bordering on fragile, under the burden of a public accounting. The ex-wives had already melted into waiting vehicles, their exits peaceful and choreographed. Kody remained vulnerable. Cameras captured every spark of outrage, every burst of desperation in his face. His lips opened as if he wanted to tell them something, to clarify, to defend. But the baying of the crowd drowned out his words. No one listened anymore. Across social media, the story exploded like wildfire. Within minutes, hashtags trended worldwide. #Kody Brown verdict. #Sister Wives courtroom. #justice for Christine. Clips of Christine, walking calmly out of the courthouse, circulated with captions, calling her the face of quiet strength. Janelle's unwavering gaze was praised as the embodiment of resilience. Meri's quiet composure was hailed as dignity in its purest form. Kody's expression, though, spoke louder. The pictures of him defeated, lost, and cornered went quicker than anything else. Memes, reactions, live streams, analyzing his downfall. His reputation wasn't bruised, it was broken. At their respective homes, the ex-wives both had their moment of isolation. Christine sat in her living room, her phone ringing non-stop with congratulatory messages. She finally gave in to a little smile, not one of triumph, but one of serenity. For the first time in years, she felt that the burden she was carrying wasn't hers any longer. Justice had taken it off her shoulders. Janelle, the tactician, was already on the phone to her advisors, planning in silence what she would do next. She wasn't jubilant, she was building. The verdict had provided her with a platform to start again, and she wasn't going to lose a moment. To her, the courtroom struggle wasn't simply the end of an era, it was the start of freedom. Meri sat by herself at her dinner table, the quiet enveloping her like a shroud. She filled herself a glass of water and gazed out the window, finally allowing tears to flow freely. But they weren't tears of defeat, they were tears of release. Years of silence, of being ignored, of clinging to hope that had been dead for years. All of it culminated in this moment. She spoke softly to herself. It's finally over. And Kody, he sat in his office, the blinds closed, phone ringing with missed calls he didn't take. The empire he believed he wielded had slipped away from him, and the one thing he prized above all else, control, was lost. He remembered the judge's words, each one more oppressive than the last. Mismanagement, concealment, breach of trust, no longer just courtroom jargon, they were the legacy imprinted on his name. For the viewers of this saga, the judgment became greater than a family feud. It became a lesson, a reminder that however skillfully someone may construct his or her persona, The truth always has a way of emerging. Betrayals in the dark ultimately turn up, and when they do, the consequences are irrepressible. As the light of day gave way to night, courthouse steps returned to their usual silence. Reporters dismantled, cameras turned off, and the reverberations of the gavel's blow still echoed in the thoughts of those present. The tale of Kody Brown had come to a crisis point, not one planned for television, not one rehearsed for the cameras, but raw, honest, and unedited. Christine, Janelle, and Meri did not look back. They did not need to. The past had been resolved, the truth had been told, and the chapter had been closed. Before them lay a future unwritten, one that was all their own. And as for Kody Brown, the man who was once at its center, the consequence was straightforward but brutal. He had lost not only a court case, but the trust, the respect, and the authority he once thought impregnable. The world had witnessed the verdict, the family had witnessed the truth, and now there was no escaping it. And the narrative of Kody Brown's courtroom reckoning would resound forever as a testament to how even the strongest veneer can fall when constructed on secrets and betrayal.